After being away on a business trip for a month, I came home with a bunch of gifts for my wife Alice White. As soon as I walked through the door, I immediately picked her up and carried her to the bedroom. After all, it had been a month without intimacy. I was eager. Alice, though, kept saying she needed to go out, but my strength was too much for her. I had her pinned to the bed and she had no choice but to submit. As I was holding Alice down, reaching for a condom from the nightstand, something made me stop. I remembered clearly that before I left, I had bought a brand new box of condoms and it had never been opened. But now, when I touched the box, I realized that it wasn't just opened, it was missing nearly all of them with only one left. What's wrong? Can't you do it anymore? Useless thing. I still have things to do, so I'm leaving. Alice pushed me off, after a long pause, then started getting dressed. But as she sat in front of me putting on her pants, I couldn't help but notice a clear red scratch mark on her backside as she left the master bedroom. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had been away for a month. There was no way Alice would have been playing with condoms by herself and that scratch mark on her, but was too obvious. It looked fresh, like it had been made not long ago using some logic. And what I knew of the situation, I came to one conclusion. Alice had cheated on me. My first instinct was to confront her. But before I could, Alice was already out the door, walking the dog. Then I remembered there were security cameras in the living room. If I checked the footage, I could find out whether anyone else had been in the house while I was gone, but when I turned on the computer, I froze. There was footage up until the moment I left on November 1st, but after that there was nothing rushing to the living room. I found the camera's power had been unplugged. I don't believe I can't find any evidence, I muttered frustration. Rising quickly, I remembered there was another camera at the elevator. I grabbed a pack of cigarettes and headed straight for the security office where I knew the guard. His name was Luca, and he had once asked me a legal question. When he saw me, he immediately offered to help. Not wanting to tell him the real reason I was there, I lied. My package disappeared from outside my door. Can you check the footage? Luca didn't hesitate and pulled up the footage from the elevator camera, asking me for the time, thinking about the fresh scratch on Alice's backside. I took a guess and told him 2 hours before I got home. Luca started reviewing the footage. At first, there was nothing, just fast-forwarding through empty moments. Then, about 10 minutes before I came home, a man wearing a baseball cap walked into the elevator area from the third-floor hallway behind him. Was Alice wearing a black silk pajama, said I had never seen before. She was waving goodbye to him, clearly reluctant. I felt my blood boil. I was ready to burst with rage, and part of me wanted to grab a knife and slice them both to pieces, right there. But Luca was still with me, so I controlled my anger and kept calm once I made my excuse and left the security booth. I finally lost it. But as I reached the bottom of my building, something clicked in my mind. I was a lawyer. If I let my emotions drive me into reckless actions, I'd ruin my own life in the process. No, I should deal with this the right way. I shouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they've gotten away with it. With that thought, I regained my composure and my expression returned to normal. As soon as I managed to steady my nerves, I saw our dog dash past me. I was puzzled. Hadn't Alice said she was taking the dog for a walk? Why was the dog running loose around the neighborhood? Now I jogged after the dog, and then I spotted something that made my blood run cold in the pavilion. Not far ahead, I saw Alice sitting in the arms of a man, hugging him intimately. The anger from the video earlier still burned in my chest, but seeing Alice in my own neighborhood holding another man like that pushed me to the brink. I felt like I could pick up a brick from the ground and smash it over their heads right then and there, but I restrained myself. Then I heard Alice's voice. She was speaking to the man, saying, "What a shame my idiot husband suddenly came home. You really made me feel so good earlier. I was so happy." The man laughed and said, Didn't your husband go away for a month? He been holding it in for a month, and he still couldn't satisfy you." Once Alice laughed too, huh? It's funny, he came home, picked me up and threw me onto the bed, ready to have sex, but when I was all set, he just couldn't do it. Huh, it really cracked me up. Then they both burst into laughter hearing Alice's words. I felt my heart shatter. Why had my health deteriorated? Wasn't it all for her to make more money to buy her a mansion, designer bags now while I'm out, working myself to exhaustion? She's at home enjoying herself with another man and then blames me for being useless. I was completely done with Alice. I didn't want to hear any more of their conversation instead. I turned around and drove straight to meet my friend Henry, who I'd met through another case as soon as I arrived at the electronics market. I asked Henry, "Do you have any hidden cameras, the kind that ordinary people wouldn't notice?" Henry worked in this field, so when he heard that even I, a lawyer, needed one, he assumed I had some strange hobby. He even offered to show me some of his best footage. I snapped at him, *CKU. Do you think I'm that kind of person? I have other uses for it. Henry, still joking, say do a lawyer. You know, those kinds of secretly filmed videos wouldn't be accepted as evidence in court. I couldn't believe he was still joking around. So I grabbed him by the neck, my voice low and threatening. "Who's the lawyer, me or you? Do you really need to teach me how to do my job after that?" Henry quickly got serious and pulled out all his hidden cameras when I saw what he had. I was taken aback. There were all kinds of bizarre cameras, some disguised as beds, covers, others in like fixtures, and even in tissue boxes, they were practically impossible to detect. I took a whole set from him, and Henry started shouting for payment. I cursed at him. "I'm doing you a favor. I'm saving you from selling these things to hurt someone else. You should thank me with the cameras in hand." I drove straight back home before I entered. I called Alice and asked where she was. She told me she was still out walking the dog, enjoying the sun, and would drop the dog off at the pet store before heading to a beauty salon with her friends. I immediately transferred her $22,000, telling her to treat herself to some skin care, since her complexion looked dull after a month without me. Alice replied almost instantly on social media with a heart emoji saying, "Love, you seeing her message made me feel sick to my stomach." Before Alice came back, I began setting up hidden cameras in the master bedroom light fixture and in the TV set tube box after everything was in place. I immediately started testing the footage on my phone. According to Henry, these cameras had built-in batteries that could support up to 3 days of recording. From now on, I needed to leave the house and give them the opportunity to do whatever they wanted. Once the devices were all set up, I double-checked the angles and placement of the cameras. Satisfied, I packed my bags and got into my car. As soon as I was in the car, I called Alice. "I've just taken on a new case and need to head out for a few days. I'll be back in about 3 days. Make sure you take good care of yourself while I'm gone." Alice, on the other end, sounded concerned. "You're working so hard already, you just got home." I swallowed my disgust, keeping my voice calm. "You wanted a big villa, right? If I don't push myself a bit harder, when will we ever be able to afford it? Thanks for working so hard. Babe, you need to take care of yourself too." She replied, her tone, which would have seemed caring before now, felt like a knife in my gut. If I were the same person I was a month ago, I would have felt touched by her concern, but now it just felt off fake like a rehearsed line. The car drove out of the community parking lot, and instead of going anywhere, I checked into a hotel right next door. It was as I was checking in that I saw a familiar face in the lobby, the same man I had seen with Alice. Only this time he was holding another woman in his arms. They were chatting and laughing as they walked toward the hotel's exit. My mind went blank. I had a sudden, horrible realization. Not only had this man slept with my Alice, but he was also sleeping with other women at the same time. This guy is something else, huh? How does he manage to sleep with so many women in a single day? I couldn't stay there anymore. I immediately abandoned my check-in and ran outside, snapping pictures as I went. Once I took the photos, I looked closer at the woman in them. She seemed vaguely familiar. She might be someone from our neighborhood, but I couldn't quite place her at that moment on the other side. My phone buzzed. Alice had already returned home as I watched the surveillance footage on my phone. My eyes shifted to the man just a few feet away. That's when I noticed Alice on the video taking off her clothes while talking on the phone. Coincidentally, the man's phone rang just a few steps ahead of me. He glanced at the screen, then hang up immediately. I could hear the woman next to him ask, "Who was that?" "Why didn't you answer?" the man casually responded. "It was the shop. They want me to come back next." I saw Alice redial the number. The man declined the call again. They were almost at the traffic light when I heard the man say, "All right. I have to go back to work. You better head home too. Don't let your husband catch on," but the woman said something that stopped me cold. She leaned on the man's shoulder, clearly reluctant to part, and said, "I just want to be with you. Why don't you quit your job? I'll take care of you." The man rejected her immediately, almost sternly. "I'm a grown man. I can't let a woman support me." They parted ways, and I turned back toward the hotel, my blood boiling once I checked into the room and entered. I once again heard Alice's voice on the phone. Her tone was angry as she questioned the person on the other end. "Where the hell did you go? Why didn't you answer my calls?" Hearing her like this only made me more furious for years, no matter how long I was away or what I was doing. Alice's only concern was, "Be safe." No other words of care, no gratitude, nothing, as I wondered what they might be discussing. Alice quickly got to the point. She put the call on speaker and told the person on the other end, "My idiot husband just left for a case he won't be home for 3 days. Do you want to come over?" Alice really is desperate. Huh. I just left, and she's already inviting another man over. I was livid, and I couldn't stop myself from kicking over a chair in the hotel room. The reply from the other side came quickly. "I'll be over in 10 minutes. Alice hummed a little tune and proceeded to strip herself down, since I had set up the camera in the bedroom. I couldn't see her as she undressed and walked out of view. All I could do was watch the camera feed closely. 10 minutes later, I heard the sound of Alice opening the door. Then I heard the man's voice. "Can't wait, huh? Clothes already off." What followed was something I never thought I'd hear from Alice, a sound that was obscene and WD. But it was what happened next that truly pushed me over the edge. The two of them hand in hand walked into the bathroom, and I didn't need to watch any further. I knew with this evidence in hand, I had more than enough to destroy them in court. Later the next day, after checking out of the hotel, I went to the electronics market to find Henry. This time, I asked him to help me look into the man's identity. It wasn't the first time I'd asked Henry for something like this, and he immediately asked for $5,000 without hesitation. I transferred him $10,000, telling him not just to uncover the man's basic information, but also to dig into his connections, hobbies, and anything else that could give me insight. Henry had never seen me so generous. He slapped his chest and said, "No problem, I'll have everything ready for you in a week." But I shook my head and replied, "I want everything in 3 days. After 3 days, I want to see everything. All right." 3 days. It is after sorting things out with Henry, I immediately drove to Alice's parents' house. Mr. and Mrs. White were surprised to see me, especially when I brought over a bunch of things. They immediately asked, "What brings you here today? Why didn't you bring Alice back with you?" I told them I was in town for a business trip and decided to stop by and check on them. Mrs. White didn't seem to mind. She took the things from me and started asking, "I heard you've been winning a lot of lawsuits this year and making quite a bit of money. How much exactly?" I smiled and said, "Didn't Alice tell you? It's just a little bit nothing worth mentioning." "How much exactly?" Mr. White asked, genuinely curious. I held up one finger and replied, $1 million. "What, 2 cases?" $1 million. Mr. and Mrs. White both sat up straight. Mrs. White immediately got up to make me some coffee as soon as she heard I made a large amount of money. Mrs. White couldn't sit still. She started talking about all the hardships she went through raising Alice, especially when she was pregnant with her. It had been incredibly tough. I quickly flattered her, saying, "Alice and I are both so grateful to you. If there's anything you need, just let us know and we'll take care of it right away." Seeing that I had said the right things, Mrs. White exchanged a meaningful glance with Mr. White. He immediately understood and started talking about how Alice's younger brother Pete had started dating a girl, but the girl was demanding she wanted a house and a car from Pete. And not just any house, she insisted on one in the city, and the car had to be a luxury one worth at least $500,000 as your brother-in-law. You can't just watch Pete stay single, right? Can you lend us some money? We were short about $500,000 to $600,000. Mr. White was hesitant, but Mrs. White cut in, saying, "You've already earned $500,000 from one case. This is just a small amount for you. Go ahead and give it to us." When I heard them asking for money, I realized they were setting me up, so I responded directly. "Sure, lending $500,000 to $600,000 to help Pete get married is no big deal." "That's great. I'll go grab my bank card. You can just transfer it directly to the account." Mrs. White practically jumped for joy when I agreed to give them the money, but I called out, "Wait, what's wrong?" "Well, the thing is, I recently presented someone in a stock case, and I met someone in the stock market. He's very capable. If I invest $1 million with him, he can make me $3 million in 3 months. So most of my money is already tied up with him." Mr. White, hearing that I had invested all my money in stocks, muttered, "Isn't it said that stocks are risky? How could you invest everything?" I quickly reassured him, "This person isn't just anyone. He's someone who guarantees profits, no risk. He's a stock market tycoon who handles millions of dollars, so he wouldn't even look at my small investment." Mr. White continued to express his concerns, mentioning how Mr. Miller from the building next door lost all his money in the stock market. However, Mrs. White seemed to have taken my words seriously. She asked me, "Are you sure this guy is that good? Can he really turn $1 million into $3 million in 3 months?" I nodded. "Yes, he can. If you don't believe me, you can search for him online. He's quite famous." I then showed her the information about this stock market mogul on my phone the moment she saw his credentials. Mrs. White was clearly impressed. To my surprise, she grabbed my hand and said, "George, we're like family, right?" I nodded. "Of course we are." Mrs. White continued, "Since we're family, we should make money together. We've got $500,000 in cash at home. How about we hand it over to that stock market mogul and see if he can help us out too?" I paused for a long moment before responding. It's not that I don't want to help, but the entry requirement is a bit high. The minimum investment is $2 million. Your $500,000 isn't enough. I really can't help you with that. The entry is $2 million. Mrs. White fell silent when she heard this, but then Mr. White tried to convince her that they didn't understand this kind of thing and shouldn't try to get involved. But Mrs. White wasn't one to back down. She finally said with determination, "If you can guarantee that $2 million will turn into $6 million in 3 months, I'll find a way to scrape together the $2 million you've gone mad." Mr. White asked Mr. White, scolded Mrs. White for being crazy. Where would they possibly come up with $2 million in cash? But Mrs. White dismissed him, saying she couldn't miss this opportunity to get rich. If they hit the jackpot, it could turn their entire life around. I still tried to warn her, reminding her that the stock market is risky. Even though the man was skilled, there was no guarantee, and I urged her to think carefully. Mrs. White, however, immediately shut me down, saying, "Just get in touch with him and get us a spot. I'll have the 2 million ready on my end." What else could I say? Reluctantly, I agreed. But before I left, I made one last point. You can borrow the money, but please don't mortgage your house. That house is the foundation for both of you, and there's no need to risk it all. It seemed like a casual comment, but Mrs. White took it to heart. Sure enough, as I was getting on the highway, Mr. White called me. He sounded frantic. "George, Mrs. White has completely lost it." I asked him what happened, and he told me that as soon as I left, Mrs. White had taken the house deed and gone straight to the bank to mortgage the house. When I heard this, I immediately told Mr. White to stop her. It was a huge mistake, but before I could finish speaking, Mrs. White grabbed the phone from him and said to me, "I'm in charge of this family now. I'll have the 2 million ready within 3 days. You'd come through for me quickly." What could I say to that? Of course, I reluctantly agreed. After that, I rushed over to the office of Marcus, the stock mogul. As soon as I walked in, I saw him yelling at his subordinates. He didn't seem to be in a good mood when he saw me. Marcus immediately changed his tone and asked what I was doing there today. I didn't waste time. I went straight to the point and said, "I heard a few of your stocks have been dropping quite a bit. Is that true?" To my surprise, the mogul responded confidently. "Who said that? I'm a legend in the stock market. The stocks I pick don't drop." I sighed and turned his screen around, pointing to the stocks that were deep in the red. "Look, I have 2 million in cash that I need you to manage. I want you to buy up all these underperforming stocks. What do you want me to buy? They're about to be delisted. I can recommend some stocks that are guaranteed to make money." He protested, but I grabbed his hand and said, "Listen, carefully. I want you to buy these trash stocks. My goal is to lose every penny of this 2 million, although he didn't understand why he eventually agreed. Probably because it's much easier to lose money in the market than to make it before I left." He added, "Don't worry. At first I'll create an illusion of profits, and on the final day we'll liquidate everything. All right, that works. Let me know when it's all set up with everything arranged." I left the building feeling satisfied. Just then, Henry from the electronics market called to tell me that he had dug up the guy's entire background. He also mentioned I found some juicy gossip about him, too. I told Henry to hold off and not share anything on the phone. I'd come by to hear all the details in person. I rushed straight to Henry's shop at the electronics market. As soon as he saw me, he greeted me with a wicked grin. "Come on in. You won't believe what I found out about the guy you asked me to look into. This guy sure knows how to live it up." As soon as I walked in, Henry immediately locked the front door, opened his computer and started showing me a massive collection of photos that his little brothers had taken in just 3 days. Henry's guys had caught Chris with 5 different women. But what really blew Henry's mind was how broad Chris's tastes were. He was involved with women ranging from a 50-year-old older woman to a 19-year-old girl. The craziest part, Henry laughed, was that my guy even caught him with 3 women in bed. At the same time, I was seriously wondering what this guy eats. He must be taking some serious supplements. I waved him off. Enough talk. Just send everything to my phone. Now I had Henry send me all the photos and made sure there were no copies left in his possession. After confirming, I handed Henry another $10,000 and told him to give it to his crew. Tell them to keep their mouths shut. Henry tried to reassure me, saying his team was trustworthy, but I insisted on paying him before I left. I gave him a final warning if Chris ever finds out I've been investigating him. You know what will happen. Got it. Henry nodded quickly, accepting the money after leaving his shop. I sat in my car and carefully went over the materials Henry had given me. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Chris was way more entangled than I'd thought. He'd managed to get 4 women from our neighborhood, and one of them was Anna, the woman I'd met at the hotel. I recognized her husband, too. He was a gangster who lent money at high interest. I thought to myself, if I hand this over to Anna's husband, Chris would probably vanish by tomorrow. But after a moment of considering, I resisted the temptation. After all, I had my own plans for dealing with Chris. I calmed myself down in the car for about half an hour before calling Alice. "I'm coming home soon. I have some great news to tell you," I said when Alice heard I was coming back. I could tell from her voice that she was nervous. I checked the surveillance footage and saw that she was in my bed, holding on to Chris. I quickly added, "The fridge is probably empty. I'll stop by the market and pick up some groceries. We'll have a drink together tonight." "Okay." Alice seemed relieved when she heard I wouldn't be home right away. She quickly told Chris to pack up and leave. I ordered takeout and continued watching Alice run around her room, probably cleaning up the evidence. Once Alice was done, my food arrived. I leisurely went upstairs, and just as I was about to enter the elevator, Chris walked out. We saw each other at the same time, and he generously stepped aside to let me in. Giving me a little nod, it wasn't the right moment to confront him, so I gritted my teeth and stepped into the elevator. Just as the doors were closing, I saw Chris flash me a smirk, almost as if he were mocking me, as though he thought I was an idiot. A second later, I pulled up the surveillance footage on my phone and overheard Alice answering Chris's call from our bedroom. Chris was laughing on the phone. "Guess who I just ran into, your idiot husband." Ha ha ha. I bumped into him when I was heading downstairs. I silently turned off the surveillance video and stood at the door for a while. Finally, when I opened the door, Alice immediately rushed over, throwing her arms around me and saying, "George, you're back. I missed you so much." I held back my disgust and didn't push Alice away. I handed her the takeout and told her to open it so we could eat together after setting the table. Alice looked at me with a soft gaze and asked George, "You said you had some good news. Did you land another big case?" I looked at the excited Alice and shook my head. "It's even better than getting a big case. Want to guess what it is?" "Did you win the lottery?" "No, you don't even play the lottery." Alice eagerly begged me to tell her what the good news was. I finally relayed what I had told Mrs. White earlier about the stock market deal as expected. Alice immediately became skeptical when I mentioned investing in stocks. After all, she knew the risk. The phrase, "the stock market is risky." "Invest with caution" was something she heard all the time. At that moment, I began to lay the trap. I told her that stock tycoon Marcus is a legend. He's never lost money in all his years. I've had to work really hard to convince him to let me in on this. "Is that so? So, how much are you planning to invest?" she asked. Clearly intrigued, "5 million. I answered, "5 million? Where are you getting that from?" Alice looked at me clearly doubting. I could come up with such a sum. I told her the truth. Marcus initially asked for 10 million, but I don't have that kind of money. I only have a little over 2 million. So I plan to sell this house to raise the rest that way. I can come up with 5 million to invest. When Alice heard I was planning to sell the house, her alarm bells went off immediately. "What if you sell the house? Where will we live?" she demanded. I pressed on with my manipulation. "You've always wanted a bigger house." "Right. If we win this, we'll be able to buy that mansion you've been dreaming of. So don't hesitate, we'll sell the house. And you still have some savings, right? We can just stay in a hotel for now, but in 3 months, that 5 million could turn into 15 million. I continued to sway her. And though Alice was still a little confused, she didn't argue further. Just then, Mrs. White called. She asked Alice if she had any money to lend her. Alice immediately asked her mom what she needed money for. Mrs. White couldn't hold back and told Alice all about the investment in stocks, mentioning how she was about to sell her house and take out a mortgage to come up with $200,000 to invest in the stock market. At this point, Alice started to believe me a bit more. Finally, Alice made up her mind. She gritted her teeth and transferred $300,000 of her savings to her mom. Then, with serious eyes, she said to me, "George, I've always trusted you. You can't let me or my family down. Our lives are in your hands." Now, of course, I nodded and reassured Alice. "Don't worry, you won't regret it. This is a sure thing." But seeing Alice hand over $300,000 to her mother like that gave me another idea. I immediately called Mrs. White and asked her to send over whatever money she had, as soon as possible. "I have good news. In just 5 days, I can double your investment upon hearing the good news." Mrs. White quickly transferred the money to me, and the amount was exactly $30,000, no more, no less. Seeing this, I knew Mrs. White was probably still a bit hesitant at that moment. I had to lay a trap for her for the next few days. Mrs. White called me daily to inquire about the returns I sent her. Fake profit charts each time. On the first day, the return was $3,000. The second day, it was $30,000. The third day, it went up to $50,000. By the fifth day, the $300,000 had turned into $500,000 without wasting a second. I immediately transferred $480,000 to Mrs. White. When she received the money, she couldn't stop smiling. But she still asked, "Why is there $20,000 missing?" I told her that $220,000 was the management fee, and with that, she smiled even wider and didn't question me any further. A few minutes later, Alice received a call from her mom on the phone. Mrs. White praised me to no end, saying that in just 5 days I had made her $180,000. By then, Alice finally believed what I'd been telling her. She softened up a lot and even wanted to make love right then and there, but I turned her down. Alice asked me what was wrong. I explained. "Marcus told me there's a major opportunity coming up next week. In 1 week. We could make 4 times, maybe even 5 times the amount, but I don't have enough money right now." Hearing there was more good news, Alice immediately said, "Didn't you say you were going to sell the house?" "I agree. Sell it right away. And my mom can put together $2 million. That should be enough." "Right?" I shook my head and told Alice, "This time, we need $10 million. Even if I sell the house urgently, we'll only have $7 million. We're still short $3 million. What should we do? Can't you borrow from your friends? You can pay them interest," Alice suggested. I shook my head again and explained, "Just because loy look wealthy doesn't mean they are. But you've got plenty of friends who are rich, don't you? Why don't you ask them for a loan?" Alice actually started thinking about which friends to borrow money from. I knew the truth. None of Alice's so-called friends were genuine. No one would be willing to lend her money. But Alice didn't realize that she immediately took out her phone and started calling her friends to borrow money. Half an hour later, Alice had nothing to show for it. She hadn't managed to borrow even a penny, let alone $3 million. Seeing this, I couldn't help but say to Alice, "Maybe it's not meant to be. Looks like we don't have the luck for this. Let's just live quietly as we are." With that, I pulled Alice toward the bedroom. But Alice wasn't interested anymore after refusing me. She said, "What's the latest?" "I can get the money by. I'll find a way." I replied, "It's best if you can get it to me by 9 a.m. on Monday, or we'll miss the opportunity without hesitation." Alice agreed. I already suspected that Alice would turn to Chris for money after watching several videos of Alice and Chris. I realized that not only did Chris enjoy deceiving women, but he was also after money. After all, why would a guy like Chris be surrounded by so many women if not to scam them? Now, Alice had handed such a profitable opportunity to Chris, and I was certain he wouldn't let it slip through his fingers to give them some space. I pretended to get a case that required me to leave town, and I went out that afternoon as soon as I reached the underground parking lot. I overheard Alice calling Chris, telling him to hurry up and come upstairs. 10 minutes later, Chris arrived at my home in a rush. As soon as he entered, he tried to get Alice to head to the bedroom with him. However, Alice pushed him away and said, "There's a chance to make money. Do you want it?" When Chris saw how serious Alice was, he eagerly nodded. "Of course, tell me how to make money." Alice then explained the stock trading plan I had pitched to her. Chris initially thought it sounded untrustworthy. Yes, some people make money trading stocks, but most lose money. That's when Alice used the same spiel she'd fed me to brainwash Chris. She told him this is insider information. Regular people don't have access to it. It's a guaranteed win if you seize this opportunity. You could be worth tens of millions, and I'll be able to openly be with you, after being coaxed by Alice. Chris finally seemed tempted. But he did tell Alice the truth that he only had a few hundred, in cash far from the $3 million required. Alice, however, gave him a terrible idea. She suggested he borrow money from a loan shark for 3 to 5 days, hearing that I couldn't help but admire how far Alice was willing to go. She was really setting her lover up to fail. Chris hesitated but eventually agreed. His reasoning was simple. The loan would only be for a few days, so the interest wouldn't be that high. Plus, one of his lovers, Anna, was married to a loan shark, so he was confident he could get a good deal on the interest. Soon, Alice and Chris finalized the loan arrangement in front of the camera, and just before Chris left, Alice reminded him, "Make sure the money is transferred by Sunday with everything set." I knew it was time to move forward. I immediately called Marcus and told him to prepare 2 contracts. I would personally bring the clients in to sign them and confirm their share. Marcus, upon hearing this, was stunned. He asked, "What's going on?" I thought it was just $2 million. Why are you preparing 2 contracts? I explained my plan. One contract for $2 million to buy junk stocks, and another for $3 million for the same purpose, essentially. I intended to lose all the money in these 2 stocks within a week. Marcus was quiet for a moment before he said, "Are these 2 people your enemies? Why do you hate them so much?" I didn't answer him and just waited for the next step to unfold on Saturday. White called. She told me she had managed to mortgage her house and Pete's car, and she'd finally gathered the $2 million she needed to send to my account. 10 minutes later, Alice called, saying the $3 million was also ready to be transferred to me, when I heard that the fish had bitten the hook. I couldn't contain my excitement. I immediately called White's wife and Alice, telling them to go to Marcus's office tomorrow morning to confirm the contracts in person. I've already made arrangements. Just go ahead, the contracts are ready for you. I encouraged Alice and White's wife to go, confidently. But White's wife was still worried. She insisted that I come in person. However, I made up an excuse about being tied up with a lawsuit after all. They were the ones signing the contracts, and if anything went wrong, they couldn't blame me after everything was set up. I called Alice again, telling her the house has already been sold. At a low price, need to move out by Sunday. I've already contacted the moving company and they might come to pick up things tonight. Alice seemed hesitant, thinking the house should be dealt with when I arrived. But when I mentioned that the buyers demanded immediate possession for the funds to go through, she reluctantly began packing. I told her to pack only her personal things and stay in a hotel for a few days. As for the house's contents, I arranged for them to be stored in a warehouse for now. In truth, I wasn't lying about selling the house from the moment I discovered Alice's affair. I had started the process of selling the house, though I did take a small loss. Lo, I was fine with it after all. It was property I had before marriage. And if things went sour, I didn't want Alice to still be in that house, refusing to leave. So I swiftly sold the house, moved out all the belongings, and effectively made Alice homeless in the future, with everything in place. I took a long vacation and went abroad. A month later, I returned from my trip. The moment I opened my phone, I saw a flood of messages from Alice White's wife, Pete White's husband, and others. At first, they were all angry, cursing me out. How could you introduce us to such a scam artist that so-called tycoon lost all our money in less than a week? And Marcus even convinced us to invest another $500,000 just when they thought they might recover. Marcus was arrested for fraud, and now they couldn't get a penny back. I couldn't help but laugh loudly at the airport when I read these messages. Who would have thought the plot would unfold so wonderfully? But the best part was the voice messages Alice sent me afterward. She was desperately trying to find me. Where did you go? Why didn't you tell me? Then I'm running out of money at the hotel. When are you coming back? Eventually, her messages turned into endless curses. She called me a liar, accusing me of scamming. Not only her parents' money, but also Pete's marriage savings. The worst part. Now she was buried in debt. Listening to those voice messages, I couldn't help but laugh so hard I almost cried. Then I thought it was time to give Chris that final blow. I pulled out my phone and sent a large batch of photos to Anna's husband's email. I knew for sure that once he saw those, he wouldn't let Chris off the hook. In fact, by the time Alice and I got divorced, Chris might have completely disappeared from the world. 2 months later, Alice and I finalized our divorce. According to the court's ruling, our joint marital property was just $250 with no debts and a dog. The judge asked how the property should be divided. I glanced at Alice and generously handed her the $250 I had. As for the dog, I also handed it over to Alice in court. Alice couldn't believe the ruling. She lashed out at the judge, accusing him of bias. After all, I was a seasoned lawyer. How could my assets only amount to $250,000? But then I had an idea. I knew there were cameras installed in our living room. All I had to do was check the footage to see if anyone had come over while I was away for a month. With you like this, you're only worth $250, I muttered. Alice, desperate, knelt before me and begged, crying, I'm not just broke. I'm also in debt to loan sharks for the sake of our past together. Please help me, just this once. I fought to hold back my laughter and with a mysterious tone whispered in Alice's ear, Here's an envelope. After you leave court, find a quiet place to open it. What's inside will be very helpful for your future. Alice was thrilled, tears welling up in her eyes, thinking I'd put a check inside. She immediately thanked me and dashed out of the courtroom, looking for a secluded spot, watching my ex-wife run off. I bowed to the judge in gratitude before heading to my new sports car, ready to leave this city behind, just as I was pulling out of the courthouse parking lot. I heard someone shouting behind me, You bastard, you'll get what's coming to you. We're still married. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw Alice chasing my car. I couldn't help but burst into laughter because the envelope didn't contain a check inside. Were just 2 sentences. The first one, the stock market is risky. Invest with caution. The second, you're my ex-wife. Your life or death is none of my business.